I don't know what made me glance toward the bleachers that afternoon. Maybe it was instinct, the kind that gnaws at you when something's wrong but you can't quite put your finger on it. I was mid-sprint on the track, feeling the burn in my legs and the rhythm of my breathing, when the sound of laughter cut through the noise of my thoughts. It wasn't just any laughter. It was Emily's. I'd recognize it anywhere. For a second, I felt a flicker of warmth. She rarely came to watch me train anymore, but maybe today was different. That warmth turned cold when I saw her, standing under the early autumn sun, her head tilted back as she laughed at something Coach Brady was saying. His arm was slung casually around her waist. I stopped dead in my tracks. My body obeyed before my mind could process what was happening. The runners behind me cursed as they veered to avoid crashing into me, but their voices faded into static. My focus was locked on Emily, my wife of 12 years, and my coach standing far too close. Brady leaned into her, whispering something that made her laugh even harder. Her hand brushed his chest, lingering longer than it should have. She looked radiant, her eyes sparkling in the way they used to when we were younger. Except now, that glow wasn't for me. I took a shaky breath, pretending to stretch so no one would notice the turmoil inside me. My heart was pounding, but not from exertion. The scene before me felt surreal, like something out of a bad soap opera. What the hell is going on? I replayed the moment in my head as I walked off the track, each step heavier than the last. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it's nothing. But no matter how I tried to frame it, the image of his hand on her waist was burned into my brain. By the time I reached the locker room, the tremor in my hands had spread to my whole body. I collapsed onto the bench, staring blankly at the row of lockers. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was this the first time? How long has this been going on? Is it even real? I wanted to march back out there, demand answers, grab Brady by the collar, and what? Cause a scene? Get myself banned from the team? What good would it do? My thoughts spiraled until the familiar sting of anger began bubbling up. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. No, I wouldn't act on impulse. Not yet. Yo, Jake, you good? One of my teammates asked, snapping me back to reality. I glanced up and saw Ryan hovering by the door, his brows furrowed in concern. I forced a tight smile. Yeah, just winded. You sure? You look kind of pale. I'm fine, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He raised his hands in mock surrender and backed off, leaving me alone with my thoughts once more. The rest of practice passed in a haze. I went through the motions, my body performing on autopilot while my mind screamed. By the time I got home that evening, I was convinced I'd imagined it all. But the moment I walked through the door and saw Emily sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, the doubts came rushing back. She looked up and smiled. Hey, babe, how was practice? Fine, I said flatly, brushing past her toward the fridge. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. She'd never looked finer herself. Hair still perfectly tousled, makeup intact. No trace of guilt or shame. Dinner's almost ready, she said, standing to check on the oven. Her voice was casual, light like it always was, like she wasn't just laughing in another man's arms hours earlier. I sat at the table, staring at her as she bustled around the kitchen. My stomach churned with unease. I wanted to confront her right then, demand to know what the hell was going on. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I waited, watching her every move, hoping the woman I thought I knew would reveal some kind of clue. That evening, Emily's laughter still echoed in my mind, and not in the way it used to when it filled our home with warmth. Now, it was sharp, mocking, a reminder of the intimacy she shared with someone else. I sat across from her at the dinner table, the aroma of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filling the room. It might as well have been ash on my tongue. So, how was practice? She asked, breaking the silence as she passed me a plate. I glanced at her, studying the ease with which she moved, the way her lips curved into a casual smile. She didn't seem nervous or guilty. Just Emily, the same woman I'd shared my life with for over a decade. But now, every gesture, every word felt suspect. Fine, I said, forcing a casual tone. The usual drills. She nodded, taking a sip of her wine. That's good. You've been working so hard lately. I stabbed at my food with my fork, my appetite non-existent. The tension was unbearable. I couldn't let this go, not without some kind of explanation. Did you go anywhere interesting today? I asked, keeping my eyes on her face. Emily paused, her wine glass halfway to her lips. Oh, not really. Just errands and yoga. Why? My grip tightened on the fork, my knuckles widening. Errands and yoga, right? Was errands code for Brady now? Was she at yoga when his hand was around her waist? No reason, I said, keeping my tone even. Just curious. She smiled, setting down her glass, and launched into a story about a rude cashier she'd encountered at the grocery store. I nodded along. My response is automatic. My mind somewhere else entirely. She was lying. I could feel it. The realization hit me like a sucker punch. This was who she'd become. A liar. A cheat. Later, as she cleared the dishes, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her. Her hair was tucked into a loose ponytail, her movements efficient as she rinsed plates and stacked them in the dishwasher. She looked so normal, so utterly familiar. And yet, she was a stranger now. Jake! Her voice startled me out of my thoughts. What? You're staring. She chuckled, her head tilting in mock concern. What's going on with you tonight? You're so quiet. I shrugged. Just tired. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't press further. Why don't you go relax? I'll finish up here. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape. Upstairs, I paced the bedroom like a caged animal. My thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and pain. Our marriage was built on trust, or so I thought. Now, I wasn't sure if I'd been blind, naive, or just plain stupid. By the time Emily came upstairs, I was in bed, feigning sleep. She slid under the covers beside me, her scent a familiar blend of lavender and vanilla. Once, that scent had brought me comfort. Now it only made my chest tighten. "Good night, babe," she whispered, brushing her lips against my cheek. I didn't respond. My jaw was clenched too tightly to speak. As the minutes ticked by, her breathing evened out, and I knew she was asleep. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on me. Trust. It's such a fragile thing. Once broken, it's almost impossible to repair. And tonight, as I lay beside the woman I'd promised forever to, I realized I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. The next morning, the tension between us hung in the air like smoke, but Emily didn't seem to notice. She hummed softly as she flipped pancakes, her voice carrying a tune I didn't recognize. Ethan, our 10-year-old, sat at the kitchen table, drumming his fingers on the wood as he waited for breakfast. For his sake, I plastered on a smile and ruffled his hair. But my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unhear Emily's laughter as Brady held her in his arms. The memory gnawed at me, a persistent ache that grew sharper every time I looked at her. "Want some coffee, babe?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "No, I'm good." My voice sounded detached, even to me. I avoided her gaze and turned to Ethan. "Big plans today, bud?" "Just soccer practice," he said, his mouth full of syrupy pancake. "Coach Brady said we're running drills." The mention of his name made my stomach churn. I forced another smile. "Sounds fun. Give it your best, okay?" "Okay, Dad." Ethan beamed, oblivious to the storm brewing between his parents. Emily joined us at the table, her plate piled high with pancakes and fruit. She looked so normal, so composed. I wondered how she managed it. Did she feel any guilt? Any remorse? Or was her betrayal just another secret she'd learned to carry without breaking a sweat? After breakfast, I dropped Ethan off at practice and headed to meet Marcus at our usual spot, a dingy bar that served the coldest beer in town. Marcus was already there, leaning against the bar with a pint in hand. "Hey, man," he said as I slid onto the stool beside him. "You look like hell. What's going on?" I hesitated. Marcus and I had been friends since college, but this was different. This wasn't a bad day at work or a stupid argument with Emily. This was my life unraveling, and I wasn't sure how to say it out loud. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I think Emily's cheating on me." Marcus's eyes widened. "What? No way. Emily? Are you sure?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "I saw her. With Coach Brady." "Brady?" Marcus set his beer down hard enough to make it slosh over the rim. "That slimeball? Are you kidding me?" I shook my head, staring at the condensation on my untouched glass. "I don't know what to do, man. Part of me wants to confront her. But what?" Marcus leaned in, his expression serious. Jake, if she's cheating, you can't just let it slide. You've got to do something. Like what? I snapped. Start a screaming match in front of Ethan? Blow up my marriage in one night. Marcus took a long sip of his beer, his gaze steady. Look, I get it. You've got Ethan to think about. But you can't let her walk all over you. You got to hit her where it hurts, Jake. Make her feel it. I frowned. What are you saying? Revenge? I'm saying don't play the fool. Don't let her think she's getting away with it. If you can't confront her yet, make her sweat. Let her know she's not as clever as she thinks. His words hung in the air, tempting and dangerous. Part of me wanted to dismiss them, to take the high road. But another part, the part that couldn't forget the sight of her with Brady, wanted exactly what Marcus was suggesting. I don't know, I said finally. This isn't who I am. Marcus clapped a hand on my shoulder. Maybe it's time to be someone else. I wasn't sure if Marcus's advice was right, but it stuck with me. As I sat in my car later that evening, parked in the lot of a hardware store, I stared at a small bag on the passenger seat. Inside was a GPS tracker and a slim voice recorder, tools that made me feel more like a private investigator than a husband. This isn't who I am, I told myself. But as I thought of Emily's laugh, the way her body leaned into Brady's, I clenched my jaw. Maybe it's who I need to be now. That night, I waited until Emily was in the shower to make my move. Her handbag sat on the kitchen counter, just within reach. My pulse hammered as I carefully unzipped it and slid the recorder inside, tucking it beneath a layer of tissues and lip gloss. My hands shook as I sealed it back up, the sound of the shower masking my movements. Next was the car. Emily had parked her SUV in the driveway, as usual. I told Ethan to finish his homework and headed outside under the guise of grabbing something from the shed. The cool night air did little to calm my nerves as I slipped the GPS tracker into the trunk lining. The device snapped into place with a satisfying click, but my heart didn't stop racing until I was safely back inside. Emily emerged from the bathroom minutes later, a towel wrapped around her. "What were you doing outside?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Just checking the shed," I said casually. "Thought I left a tool out." She shrugged, seemingly unbothered, and disappeared into the bedroom. If she noticed anything out of the ordinary, she didn't show it. The next day, while Emily took Ethan to soccer practice, I sat at my computer, staring at the GPS tracking software. A small green dot marked her car's location, the field where practice was held. I felt a flicker of guilt. What was I expecting to find? Proof that she was lying? Maybe she was just dropping Ethan off, like any normal mom. Then the dot moved. My breath hitched as I watched it leave the field and head west, toward Brady's neighborhood. I zoomed in, my heart sinking as her car stopped at an address I recognized. Coach Brady's house. So much for yoga classes. The GPS wasn't enough. I needed to hear it, to know for sure. That evening, after she came home smiling and kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong, I retrieved the voice recorder from her bag while she was putting Ethan to bed. I locked myself in the basement, my hands trembling as I plugged the device into my laptop and hit play. Her voice came through clear as day. "Today was amazing," she said, her tone light, flirtatious. Brady's voice followed. "You're incredible, Em. I don't know how I got this lucky." She laughed, the same laugh that haunted me since the track field. "We just have to be careful. Jake's sharp. He'll catch on if we're not." Brady chuckled. "Let him try. What's he going to do?" The recording ended with the sound of a car door shutting and Emily humming to herself. I sat back in my chair, my chest tight. Any lingering hope that I was overreacting shattered in an instant. This wasn't just a one-time mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated. The woman I loved, the mother of my child, was lying to me with a confidence that left me cold. I pressed play again, listening to her words until they were seared into my brain. I wanted to confront her immediately, to storm upstairs and demand answers. But I stopped myself. Confrontation wouldn't undo the damage. I needed a plan. Marcus's voice echoed in my head. Make her feel it. By the time Emily came downstairs the next evening, I was ready. The recorder sat in my pocket, and my stomach churned with a mixture of dread and determination. She entered the living room, her hair damp from a shower, wearing the oversized hoodie she always claimed was her favorite. It was one I bought her years ago, back when our marriage felt solid and unshakable. "Hey," she said, flashing me a smile as she plopped onto the couch. "What's for dinner tonight? Should I order something?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood and reached into my pocket, pulling out the small speaker I'd connected to the recorder earlier. Her smile faltered as I placed it on the coffee table between us and pressed play. Today was amazing. Her voice floated from the speaker. We just have to be careful. Jake's sharp. He'll catch on if we're not. Emily froze, her color draining. Her hand stopped halfway to her wine glass, and for a moment, the room was completely silent except for Brady's laugh echoing in the background. Let him try, Brady's voice said, smug and dismissive. What's he going to do? I let the recording finish, then looked at her. Well, my voice was low-cold. I barely recognized it. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her face contorted as though she was deciding whether to deny it or beg for forgiveness. Finally, she settled on the latter. Jake, how long? I cut her off. My words were clipped, sharp as broken glass. How long has this been going on? She swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. It's not what you think, she whispered. I slammed my palm against the table, making her jump. Don't insult me like that. I heard you, Emily. I saw you. So don't you dare sit there and lie to me. Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. I don't know, she sobbed. A few months? It wasn't supposed to mean anything. Stop. My voice cracked, and I hated how raw it sounded. It wasn't supposed to mean anything? That's your excuse? You're sneaking around behind my back, lying to our son, risking everything we've built, and it doesn't mean anything. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she choked out. I didn't mean for this to happen. I stood abruptly, pacing the room to keep myself from exploding. You didn't mean for this to happen? What, did you trip and fall into his arms? Is that how it works? Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't feel any satisfaction. If anything, her tears only fueled the fire inside me. I stopped pacing and turned to face her. What about Ethan? Did you think about him? About what this would do to him? She shook her head, her voice barely audible. I didn't think. No, you didn't. I ran a hand through my hair, breathing heavily. You didn't think about me, or him, or anyone but yourself. Her silence was deafening. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. Jake, I love you. I've always loved you. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. Please, don't give up on us. I stared at her, my heart twisting. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. But the memory of her laughter with Brady, the sound of her voice on the recording, crushed any hope I had left. No, I said quietly. You don't get to call this a mistake. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary or burning dinner. This was a choice. A choice you made over and over again. Her tears turned to sobs, but I was done. I turned toward the door, needing air, space, anything but the sight of her broken expression. As I grabbed my keys, I looked back at her one last time. You say you love me, I said, my voice hollow. But love doesn't look like this, Emily. Not even close. And with that, I left, letting the door close behind me. I drove aimlessly that night, the weight of Emily's betrayal pressing down on my chest like a lead vest. The streets blurred as I turned corners without thinking, barely aware of where I was going. Somehow, I ended up in front of Marcus's place. His porch light was on, a faint glow against the dark, and I could see the flicker of the television through the living room window. He answered the door within seconds, his face shifting from surprise to concern when he saw me. Jake, you okay? No, I said flatly. Can I come in? Marcus stepped aside, and I followed him into the living room. The faint smell of popcorn lingered in the air, and a basketball game played on the TV. He grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and handed me one without a word. We sat in silence for a few minutes before he spoke. Did you confront her? I nodded, twisting the bottle in my hands. She admitted it, said it's been going on for months. Marcus let out a low whistle. Man, I am sorry. What now? I don't know, I muttered. Part of me wants to walk away, but... Ethan. Yeah. Marcus took a sip of his beer. You've got to think about him. As we sat there, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting it to be Emily. But the name on the screen made my stomach flip. Sophia Brady. What the hell? Marcus said, leaning over to glance at the screen. Why is Brady's wife calling you? I don't know. My thumb hovered over the accept button before I finally pressed it. Hello? Jake. Her voice was strained, clipped. I need to talk to you. Can we meet? My pulse quickened. Why? Because I know about Emily and my husband, she said, her words sharp enough to cut glass. And I think we can help each other. 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Sophia in a small diner on the edge of town. She looked as composed as ever, her dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and her blazer immaculate. But there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I almost didn't believe it when I first suspected, she said, stirring her coffee absently. But then I found texts, photos, and eventually I didn't need to suspect anymore. I nodded, the bitterness rising in my throat. Same here. She leaned forward, her expression fierce. Brady thinks he's invincible. He's always been like that. But this time, he's gone too far. And Emily? I don't care what happens to her, but I'm not letting him ruin my family. What are you suggesting? I asked warily. I'm suggesting we expose them, Sophia said, her voice steady. Together, we gather every piece of evidence we can and make it impossible for them to keep this a secret. Her words hung in the air, tempting and dangerous. Part of me wanted to walk away, to handle this on my own terms. But another part, the part that was tired of feeling powerless, knew she was right. They won't see it coming, she continued, her lips curling into a grim smile. And when we're done, they'll regret ever thinking they could get away with this. I took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. All right, I said finally. Let's do it. For the first time that night, Sophia's expression softened. Good. Then let's make them pay. The next few weeks were a blur of late-night phone calls and covert meetings with Sophia. She was efficient, almost surgical in her approach, turning her suspicions into an airtight plan to bring down both Brady and Emily. It felt strange, partnering with the wife of the man who had wrecked my marriage, but in Sophia, I found someone who understood my anger, someone just as determined to see justice done. First, we need a lockdown proof, Sophia said during one of our meetings. We sat in a corner booth at a different diner this time, far from prying eyes. She slid a folder across the table. I've been gathering this for weeks. Inside were printouts of text messages, phone call logs, and even pictures. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, each one a dagger twisting in my chest. There was a photo of Emily, her face lit up with a smile, sitting too close to Brady at what looked like a coffee shop. Another showed them holding hands in the parking lot of a gym. I hate seeing this, I muttered, closing the folder and shoving it away. Sophia nodded, her jaw tight. So do I. But it's what we need. The more we have, the less they can deny. I contributed to the pile of evidence, checking the GPS tracker on Emily's car daily. The results were sickeningly predictable. Every few days, her car would find its way to Brady's house. Sometimes it stayed there for an hour, sometimes longer. The voice recorder provided even more damning material. Emily's tone when she spoke to Brady was soft, flirtatious, full of warmth I hadn't heard from her in years. You make me feel alive, she said during one recording. Another time, she laughed and said, Jake doesn't suspect a thing. He's so focused on work. Sophia and I took turns piecing everything together. We cataloged dates, times, and locations, cross-referencing them until the timeline was undeniable. The evidence piled up, turning my heartbreak into anger, and then into something colder, resolve. One evening, as we sat in Sophia's home office, she turned to me with a sharp look. What's the endgame here, Jake? What do you want out of this? I hesitated, leaning back in the chair. I want Ethan to be okay. I want to make sure he doesn't lose out because of her choices. Sophia nodded, folding her arms. And Emily? I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her questions settle over me. I want her to face the consequences. I don't know if she'll ever feel the pain she's caused, but I want her to know she can't just walk away from this without repercussions. A faint smile touched Sophia's lips. Good? Then let's make sure they both feel it. The first step was to make Brady's life as difficult as possible. Sophia, being the meticulous planner she was, had already drafted an anonymous letter to his athletic board. This will force their hand, she said as she sealed the envelope. If they investigate and find even half of what we have, he's finished. I watched her, a mixture of admiration and unease blooming in my chest. What about Emily? Sophia raised an eyebrow. We hit her where it hurts, socially, financially, personally. She's not innocent in this, Jake. She made her choices. The coldness in her voice mirrored what I felt inside. As we worked late into the night, I realized we weren't just exposing them. We were building a trap. One that neither Emily nor Brady would escape unscathed. I was halfway through cataloging another batch of GPS logs when I stumbled upon something unexpected, an old photo. It had slipped from one of the folders and landed on the desk. Picking it up, I stared at it for a long moment. It was from a trip Emily and I had taken years ago, long before the cracks in our marriage started to show. In the photo, we were standing on a rocky shoreline, her arm draped around my waist as we smiled into the camera. The wind had tousled her hair, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. I could still remember the way she'd laughed that day, the sound pure and uninhibited. It was a laugh that belonged to us, a shared moment that no one else could claim. For the first time in weeks, the ice in my chest began to thaw. My anger and betrayal ebbed, replaced by an ache that felt far worse. I missed her, or at least I missed the woman I thought she was. The Emily in this picture wasn't the same Emily sneaking off to Brady's house. She couldn't be. That Emily had been mine, hadn't she? I leaned back in my chair, the photo still in my hand, and let myself sink into the memory. It was easier than facing the truth. For a fleeting moment, I let myself believe there was a way to fix this. Maybe Emily wasn't entirely lost. Maybe, despite everything, there was still something worth saving. Later that evening, I found myself lingering in the kitchen while Emily made tea. She was humming softly to herself, the same way she always did when she thought no one was listening. I watched her for a moment, the ache in my chest intensifying. "Do you remember that trip we took to Maine?" I asked, my voice quiet. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Maine? Of course. That was such a beautiful place." I nodded, the photo still tucked into my pocket. "We stayed in that little cabin by the shore. You loved the view from the deck." Emily smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "I remember. You tried to make pancakes one morning and nearly set the place on fire." A small chuckle escaped me despite myself. "They were salvageable." "Barely," she teased, her smile widening. For a moment, it felt like we were back there, before everything had fallen apart. I wanted to believe in that version of us again. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression faltered, and she set down her mug. "Of course I do, Jake. I miss a lot of things." Her words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to press her, to ask what exactly she missed, but the moment was already slipping away. She turned back to her tea, and the distance between us felt insurmountable. That night, as I lay in bed, the photo sat on the nightstand beside me. I stared at it until my eyes burned, wondering if there was a version of this story where we found our way back to each other. But as my mind wandered, so did the images. Emily's laughter with Brady, the text messages, the recordings. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. By the time sleep finally claimed me, the thaw in my chest had turned back to ice. Love, or whatever was left of it, wasn't enough. Not anymore. The following evening, I was sitting on the couch, lost in thought, when Emily sat down beside me. It was rare for her to initiate anything these days, and her presence caught me off guard. She looked nervous, wringing her hands as if she were preparing for battle. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. I set down the remote and turned to face her. "Go ahead." Her eyes darted to the floor, and she took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what's been happening." My jaw tightened. I wasn't in the mood for more excuses, but I forced myself to stay silent. "You're right," she continued. "I've been lying to you. About where I've been, about Brady, about everything." Her voice cracked, and she wiped at her eyes, but she pressed on. "It started months ago. At first, it was just conversations. Nothing serious. I don't know what I thought. But then it became more, and I didn't know how to stop. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't stopped. But I just stared at her, my emotions warring between fury and something I couldn't quite name. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jake," she said, her voice breaking. I was unhappy. Lonely. I didn't know how to tell you. Lonely." The word burned in my throat. "We have a son, a family. If you were lonely, you could have talked to me. Instead, you went to him." She flinched at the accusation, tears spilling freely now. I know I screwed up. I know I betrayed you. But I never stopped loving you. I swear, Jake. Don't, I said, my voice sharp. Don't tell me you love me while you're sneaking off with another man. Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said through sobs. I had to tell you the truth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the woman who had been my partner, my best friend, and wondered how we had ended up here. Why now? I asked finally. Why confess now? After all this time? She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. Because I can't keep doing this. The lies, the guilt, it's killing me. And I hate what it's doing to you, to us. Her words hung in the air, but they felt hollow. Too little, too late. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just hurt me. You've hurt Ethan. You've broken something we can't put back together. She reached for me, her hand trembling, but I pulled away. The pain in her eyes was almost enough to weaken my resolve. Almost. Jake, she whispered, her voice desperate. I want to fix this. Please, let me fix this. I stood, the weight of her confession pressing down on me like a physical force. You want to fix it? Then start by being honest. Not just with me, but with yourself. She stared at me, her tears falling silently now, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I had married, the one who had promised to stand by me no matter what. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I need time, I said finally, turning toward the stairs. I need space to figure out what's next. She didn't try to stop me, and as I climbed the steps, her quiet sobs followed me. They should have brought me comfort, knowing she felt the weight of her choices. But they didn't. They just made the emptiness inside me grow. Emily's confession left me reeling, but it also solidified one thing in my mind. I couldn't stay in this limbo. She had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. I spent the next day reviewing everything Sophia and I had gathered, the GPS logs, the recordings, the photos. Every piece of evidence was a reminder of Emily's betrayal, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about securing my future, and more importantly, Ethan's. That evening, I called my lawyer, Lisa Grant, a sharp and no-nonsense woman I'd known since college. I told her everything. The affair, the recordings, the plans Emily and Brady had been making behind my back. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake, she said finally, her tone measured, you've got a solid case here. But you need to decide what you want out of this. Are you aiming for a clean divorce? Full custody of Ethan? Or do you want to take this further? I want Ethan to stay with me, I said without hesitation. Emily's decisions have already hurt him enough. I won't let her drag him through more of this. Understood, Lisa replied. But be prepared. Custody battles can get messy, especially when infidelity is involved. If Emily fights back, it could get ugly. I'll do whatever it takes, I said firmly. Just tell me what I need to do. The next step was setting the wheels in motion. Lisa advised me to gather as much documentation as possible to show that I was the more stable parent. I started keeping meticulous records of my time with Ethan, school drop-offs, soccer practices, homework sessions. I wanted to make it clear that his well-being was my top priority. At the same time, I worked with Sophia to escalate our plan against Brady. She had already sent an anonymous letter to his athletic board, outlining his inappropriate relationship with Emily and providing enough evidence to warrant an investigation. We knew it was only a matter of time before the fallout began. A week later, the first crack appeared. Sophia called me, her voice brimming with satisfaction. Brady's been suspended, she said. They're investigating him for misconduct. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Good. He deserves it. He does, she agreed. But we're not done yet. She was right. While Brady's professional life was unraveling, Emily still walked around as though nothing had changed. She even made a point of trying to act like the perfect wife, cooking elaborate dinners and offering to help with Ethan's school projects. But it was all a facade, and I wasn't buying it. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Emily broke the silence. I've been thinking, she said, her tone hesitant. Maybe we should see a counselor. For Ethan's sake, if nothing else. I set down my fork, meeting her gaze. Counseling isn't going to fix this, Emily. What's broken between us, it's not something you can patch up with a few sessions. Her face fell, but she pressed on. I know I've hurt you, Jake, and I know it's going to take time, but I want to try. For Ethan. I wanted to believe her. For a brief moment, I even considered it. But the image of her with Brady, laughing and whispering like I didn't exist, flashed in my mind. I'll think about it, I said finally, though the words felt hollow. As she nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes, I felt the first pang of guilt. But I pushed it aside. Emily had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. In the days that followed, I focused on preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I filed for divorce, citing infidelity, and included a request for primary custody of Ethan. The papers were delivered to Emily at work, on Lisa's advice, to ensure she couldn't deny receiving them. That evening, when she came home, she slammed the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. "You served me at work?" she shouted, her face red with anger. "I did," I said calmly. "Because this isn't just about us anymore. It's about Ethan, and I won't let you keep tearing this family apart." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, I didn't flinch. I was done playing the role of the forgiving husband. It was time to stand my ground. Emily didn't take the divorce papers well. For days, she alternated between cold silence and fiery outbursts. At first, I thought it was guilt or fear of losing Ethan. But then I learned the truth, a truth that cut deeper than I thought possible. It was Sophia who uncovered it. We had developed a routine by now, meeting every few days to exchange updates. One evening, she arrived at my house, her face set in a grim expression. "You're not going to like this," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "What is it?" I asked, already bracing myself. Sophia handed me a manila envelope. I got curious. I wanted to know how far Brady and Emily were planning to take this. So I did some digging. Inside the envelope were copies of emails between Emily and Brady. They weren't just making plans to continue their affair. They were planning to leave their families entirely. My stomach churned as I read the messages. Emily and Brady had been discussing moving to another state, finding a place where they could start fresh. Brady wrote about looking for new coaching jobs, while Emily mentioned wanting to keep things amicable with me for Ethan's sake. They even talked about selling their homes and pooling their money. Amicable, I muttered, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Unbelievable. Sophia crossed her arms, her expression dark. They're cowards, both of them. They want to blow up two families and then waltz off into the sunset like nothing happened. I tossed the envelope onto the coffee table and stood, pacing the room. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with questions. How long have they been planning this? The earliest email is from 3 months ago, Sophia said. But who knows how long they've been talking about it in person? 3 months. While I was at work, while I was helping Ethan with his homework, while I was lying awake at night trying to figure out how to save my marriage, Emily had been planning her escape. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. Later that night, I confronted Emily. She was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when I dropped the envelope on the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "Go ahead. Open it." She hesitated, then pulled out the papers. Her face paled as she scanned the emails, and when she looked up at me, there was a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Jake, I can explain." "No," I snapped, my voice sharp. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify this. You lied to me. Again." "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. "We were just what?" I cut her off. "Just planning to rip Ethan away from everything he knows? Just plotting to ruin two families? What part of this is not like that, Emily?" She burst into tears, but I wasn't moved. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I didn't." "Stop." I held up a hand, my voice cold. "You've been not meaning to do things for months. But every single step of this was a choice. Your choice. And now you're going to face the consequences." Her sobs turned to quiet hiccups, and she buried her face in her hands. For the first time, I felt nothing but numbness. No anger, no sadness, just the realization that whatever love I'd had for her was gone. The next day, I called Lisa to update her on the situation. She was unfazed, her professionalism as steady as ever. "This actually strengthens your case," she said. "It shows a clear pattern of behavior that prioritizes her desires over Ethan's well-being." "Good," I said, "because I'm not backing down. As I hung up the phone, I thought about Ethan. He didn't know the details of what was happening, but he wasn't oblivious. The tension in the house, the late-night arguments, he could sense it all. I hated what this was doing to him, but I knew it was better than the alternative. Better than letting Emily and Brady uproot his life without a second thought. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of resolve. I couldn't change the past, but I could fight for Ethan's future. And I wouldn't stop until I'd done everything in my power to protect him. By the end of the week, the tension in the house was unbearable. Emily and I barely spoke, and when we did, the words were clipped, sharp, and loaded with resentment. Ethan, caught in the middle, was the only reason I hadn't packed my bags and left. I stayed for him, though it was clear he was feeling the strain. One evening, as I helped Ethan with his math homework at the kitchen table, he paused mid-problem and looked at me with wide, concerned eyes. "Dad?" he asked quietly. "Yeah, buddy," I replied, keeping my voice as light as possible. "Are you and Mom okay?" His voice wavered, and the question hit me like a punch to the gut. I set my pencil down and met his gaze. "Why do you ask that?" He hesitated, chewing on his bottom lip. "You've been fighting. I hear you guys at night. And Mom's been crying a lot." I sighed, running a hand over my face. "How do you explain something like this to a 10-year-old? "Ethan," I said gently, "things have been tough lately between me and Mom. But I want you to know something. None of this is your fault." "Okay." His brows furrowed, and he looked down at his homework. "Are you guys getting divorced?" The question hung in the air, heavy and painful. I wanted to tell him no, to reassure him that everything would be fine. But I couldn't lie to him. "Not now. We're figuring things out," I said carefully. "But no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. That's a promise." Ethan nodded, but his face was still etched with worry. "I don't want things to change," he whispered. "I like it when we're all together." The knot in my chest tightened. "I know, buddy, and I wish I could promise that nothing will change. But sometimes things happen that we can't control. What we can control is how we handle them. And I promise, no matter what, I'll make sure you're okay." Later that night, I stood outside Ethan's bedroom door, listening as he softly cried himself to sleep. It broke me in a way nothing else had. All the anger I'd felt toward Emily, all the determination I'd had to expose her, was overshadowed by the sound of my son's heartbreak. I went downstairs and found Emily in the living room, scrolling through her phone. Without a word, I sat across from her, my arms folded. "Ethan asked me if we're getting divorced," I said flatly. Emily froze, her expression shifting from surprise to guilt. "What did you say?" I told him the truth, that we're figuring things out. Her eyes glistened, and she set her phone aside. "Jake, I never wanted this to hurt him." "Well, it has," I said, my voice low. "Whatever you thought this was, whatever excuses you've been telling yourself, it's affecting him now. And you need to think about that before you make another decision." Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like the woman I used to know. Vulnerable. Human. "I hate what this has done to us," she whispered. "To him." "Then stop making it worse," I said, standing. "Think about someone other than yourself for once." That night, as I lay awake, the sound of Ethan's earlier sobs echoed in my mind. This wasn't just about me or Emily anymore. It was about protecting him from the fallout of her decisions. And as much as it hurt to see him in pain, it only strengthened my resolve. Whatever happened next, I wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. I was fighting for Ethan, for his future, for his happiness, and I wasn't going to lose. A few days later, the fallout from Sophia's anonymous letter began to spread. News of Coach Brady's suspension rippled through the community, whispered about in school parking lots and at soccer practices. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into outright accusations, and Brady's perfect reputation started to crumble. I didn't need to be at the field to know how it was playing out, but curiosity got the better of me. I drove to Ethan's soccer practice that afternoon, parking at a distance where I could watch without being noticed. Brady wasn't on the field. Another coach was running drills, his expression tense as he tried to keep the kids focused. Sophia's car pulled up a few minutes later, and she stepped out, dressed sharply as always. She spotted me leaning against my truck and walked over, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Did you hear?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I saw he's not here," I said. "What happened?" "Brady's on administrative leave while they investigate," Sophia said, crossing her arms. "Apparently, A few other parents have come forward with complaints. Seems your wife wasn't the only one he got too close to. The words hit me harder than I expected. So, he's been doing this with other women too? Sophia nodded. And not just women. There's a rumor that he's been inappropriate with some of the moms on the PDA. If it's true, his career's finished. I exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and anger swirling in my chest. Brady's downfall was satisfying, but it also underscored just how reckless Emily had been. Good, I said finally. Let him face the consequences. As the investigation into Brady unfolded, Emily's role in the scandal came to light. At first, it was just whispers, people piecing together details and drawing their own conclusions. But then someone apparent maybe spread the word about the emails and texts Sophia had unearthed. By the end of the week, Emily's name was being mentioned in the same breath as Brady's, and the fallout reached our doorstep. Emily came home from work one evening, her face pale and her hands trembling. She threw her bag onto the counter and slumped into a chair, burying her face in her hands. What happened? I asked, though I already had a good idea. They know, she said, her voice muffled. Everyone knows. Someone leaked the emails. I didn't bother hiding my reaction. Good. They should. Emily looked up, her eyes red and pleading. Jake, do you have any idea what this is doing to me? People at work are avoiding me. The other parents won't even look at me. I'm being treated like a pariah. I crossed my arms, my voice cold. What did you think was going to happen, Emily? You and Brady didn't exactly keep things subtle. Did you really think you could sneak around forever without anyone finding out? She flinched at my words, her tears spilling over. I know I messed up, okay? But I don't deserve this. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. You don't get to play the victim here. Not after everything you've done. The next day, I dropped Ethan off at school and noticed the way people looked at me, curious, cautious, like they were trying to piece together the story. A few moms whispered to each other as I walked by, their glances darting away when I met their eyes. It was infuriating and humiliating, but I kept my head high. This wasn't about me. It was about making sure Ethan didn't bear the brunt of the fallout. Later that afternoon, Sophia called with an update. Brady's resignation is imminent, she said. He's trying to save face, but it won't work. Too much has come out. And Emily? I asked. She's already a target, Sophia replied. But if you want her to feel the full weight of this, there's one more thing we can do. Sophia leaned in during our phone call, her voice sharp with focus. We can take this a step further, Jake. Public exposure might not just cost Brady his career. It could force Emily to face real consequences too. I frowned, gripping the phone tighter. What kind of consequences? You have the emails, Sophia continued. The ones where they're discussing their plans to leave. If we make those public, it won't just humiliate them. It'll destroy their credibility entirely. No one will trust either of them again. The thought gave me pause. The anger I felt toward Emily was justified, but this felt different. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about dismantling everything she had left. For a brief moment, I thought of Ethan, how he might feel if the scandal became even bigger. I don't know, I said finally. Ethan's already dealing with enough. I don't want to make it worse for him. Sophia sighed, her tone softening. I get it, but think about this. If you don't take a stand now, they might try to spin the story in their favor. This is your chance to control the narrative. I'll think about it, I said, ending the call. That evening, Emily approached me while Ethan was at a friend's house. Her face was pale, her movements hesitant as she sat down across from me. I want to talk, she said, her voice quiet. About everything. I folded my arms, waiting for her to continue. I know I've hurt you, she began, her eyes glistening with tears. And I know I've ruined so much. But I don't want to lose Ethan. Please, Jake. Let's work something out. I raised an eyebrow. Work something out? Like what? Emily's hands trembled as she reached for a piece of paper she'd brought with her. I'll agree to the divorce terms. Full custody for you. I'll do whatever you want, as long as you don't make this any worse than it already is. Her words caught me off guard. For weeks, she'd been fighting to salvage her image, trying to spin the situation into something less damning. But now, here she was, ready to concede everything. Why the sudden change? I asked, my voice cold. She looked down, her shoulders slumping. People are already tearing me apart. The parents at school, my co-workers. I don't know how much more I can take. If you keep pushing, I'll have nothing left. I want to find a way to move forward. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. She wasn't the confident, self-assured Emily I'd known, or the calculated woman who had lied to me for months. She was desperate, defeated. After she left the room, I sat in silence, staring at the papers she'd handed me. Part of me wanted to take the offer and end this nightmare once and for all. But another part of me, the part still raw with betrayal, hesitated. Sophia's words echoed in my mind. This is your chance to control the narrative. I grabbed my phone and dialed Sophia. I'm in, I said when she answered. Good, she replied. Let's make sure they never forget what they've done. The plan was set. With Sophia's help, we compiled every piece of evidence we had. Emails, texts, GPS logs, and recordings. It was all packaged neatly and anonymously sent to the community's most prominent online forum, where gossip spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, the post gained traction. Brady's name was already tarnished, but now Emily's involvement was laid bare for everyone to see. The fallout was immediate. I stayed away from the comments, unwilling to read the vitriol, but I knew it was bad. Emily came home that evening, her face ashen. She stood in the doorway, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Jake, she whispered, her voice trembling. Did you do this? I didn't answer right away. I met her gaze, my expression hard. You did this, Emily. You and Brady. I just made sure everyone else saw the truth. Her lips quivered, and she sank into the nearest chair. Do you have any idea what they're saying about me? About us? I don't care what they're saying about you, I said bluntly. I care about Ethan. And now, he'll know it wasn't me who broke this family apart. Emily's tears came fast, but I didn't waver. For months, I'd been the one holding everything together while she played the victim. Now the scales had finally tipped. A week later, the dust was beginning to settle. Brady had officially resigned from his position, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the real story. Emily, meanwhile, had been called into her boss's office to discuss her future with the company. She didn't give me the details, but the weight of her silence said enough. As for me, I moved forward. The divorce was finalized with minimal resistance from Emily. Her initial offer of full custody and favorable terms for me stood. Ethan stayed with me most of the time, though Emily still had visitation rights. She tried to put on a brave face for him, but the strain showed. One evening, Ethan and I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. He was quiet, his brow furrowed as he stared at the horizon. What's on your mind, Butt? I asked, ruffling his hair. Mom says she messed up, he said after a long pause. She says she's really sorry. I nodded, choosing my words carefully. She did mess up, and she's going to spend a long time making up for it. Do you hate her? He asked, his voice small. I thought about it, about all the anger, the betrayal, and the pain she'd caused. But when I looked at Ethan, I realized the answer wasn't so simple. No, I said honestly. I don't hate her. I'm angry with her, and I'm hurt by what she did. But she's still your mom, and I know she loves you. He nodded, his eyes glassy. I love her too, but I don't like what she did. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. That's okay, buddy. You're allowed to feel that way. In the weeks that followed, I found a strange sense of peace. The chaos that had consumed my life for months was finally fading. I focused on my work, my home, and, most importantly, Ethan. Emily tried to rebuild her life, though it was clear she would never fully escape the shadow of her actions. As for Brady, the last I heard, he had moved out of town. The thought of him no longer filled me with rage. It barely registered at all. One afternoon, as I stood on the back porch watching Ethan kick a soccer ball around the yard, I realized something. I had survived. The life I'd built wasn't the one I'd imagined, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to move forward.